Did you want to say anything first, Esther, or not?
Sure. And then I will hand it over to you, Chair. Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair, Vice Chair, Commissioners, and members of the public. Today is March 29, and welcome to our work session, primarily revolving around the climate-friendly and equitable communities rulemaking. Welcome, Chair MacArthur, Vice Chair Halova, Commissioners Lilac, Sandoval, and Boyer, and Warren. We also have Director Rue, Deputy Director Green, and staff Bill Holmstrom, Kevin Young, Evan Manville, and Cody Meyer, who will lead our work session. Thank you, Chair MacArthur.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Appreciate that. Hello, everybody, staff, fellow commissioners, and the listening public. Welcome to our special work session on climate-friendly and equitable communities rulemaking. Just want to clarify the purpose of today relative to Thursday. So today is our time as commissioners to really understand the draft that is before us. The listening public, people are, it was a publicly notified meeting, people are welcome to listen in, but they will not be able to testify, and consequently, we are required to keep our conversation about, or not discussion about, clarifying what the rules say. And so I really encourage commissioners to ask lots of questions, but please try to ask the questions in a way that does not convey your thought about which direction to go or any kind of guidance, but more so along the lines of clarifying questions. You'll have plenty of time for guidance on Thursday. And on Thursday is our first public hearing, so it is really important that we have this meeting today with staff, and I want to thank them for taking the extra time to do that. We will be taking, I've been asked several questions about how is a two set of hearings. Thursday is the first hearing on this. The one in May is the final one, second hearing. And so the purpose behind the first hearing is to, or at least the logistics of it, we'll have another conversation with staff about anything that's unresolved today in terms of our understanding of the rule, draft rule. We'll take public testimony. You also have, as you all have been looking at, is the written testimony we received. And then the hope is by the end of the Thursday meeting, first hearing, that we'll be able to identify those issues that we do not believe as a commission need further refinement. And then also at the same time, identify those issues that might need more refinement. And then we provide guidance as a commission on those. And so, and then there might be some technical things that happen along with that, but I want to keep our conversation at the policy level so that we give staff correct direction or guidance anyway on Thursday. Today, however, we're not providing any kind of guidance. We're just asking questions. And so hopefully that clarifies that, but I'm happy to entertain a question or two from commissioners if that distinction and our trajectory is unclear. Not seeing anyone raise their hand. Okay, I'll turn it over to staff. Thanks for being here and for all your work.
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. Bill Holmstrom, DLCD staff, thank you again for taking your time to meet with us and have this work session, which I think we've done. This is the third time we've done this, and the last few times I think the sessions were productive and fruitful and helpful for the commission, hopefully. So, of course, please interject and ask questions all the way throughout our presentation. We do have a few slides to go through today to kind of cover some key topics which were covered in the staff report. We want to make sure that we're touching on them and providing some background for you. So let me go ahead and share my screen.
You're on mute, Bill.
All right, hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yes, and we can hear you too.
Good. All right, good. All right, so real quickly today we're going to hear, first of all, talk a little bit about implementation and funding, of how we have been working with our partners around the state to make sure that we're going to be able to make these rules work over the next few years. And we'll be having a conversation about that. And then we'll get into a few key issues around the rules. And again, those are, if you read your staff report, it's going to look pretty familiar around timing, some changes and tweaks that we've made to our rules around reducing driving, meeting our greenhouse gas reduction targets, and regional planning. A little bit about bicycle network standards, some changes that we've had to make around electric vehicle charging, and then getting to some details around climate-friendly areas. And of course, if commissioners have questions about any other parts of the draft rules, be happy to answer those as well. So hopefully we'll be able to get through these, answer any questions, and then have a little bit of time for additional questions from commissioners as well. So I think I'm going to hand it over to, am I handing it over to you, Cody, to start? Yeah, to talk about implementation and funding.
Great, thank you, Bill. Hello, Chair MacArthur, Vice Chair Hello, and Commissioners. Glad to be here. My name is Cody Meyer. I'm a land use transportation planner with the department. If you want to go to this next slide, Bill, we're going to go over a little bit of the implementation and funding that we have in the staff report. And just again, as a reminder, we're talking about rules and implementing those rules for the state's metropolitan areas. A lot of the work has been done in the Portland metro region. So I would say a lot of what we're talking about is kind of geared towards the downstate MPOs. Portland Metro is unique. They've been doing a lot of this work. They can make findings for local governments in TPR through their regional transportation plan. And it's just a little bit different there. So just want to throw that caveat on there. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's see. The implementation timeline, we're looking at page 13 and 14 of your staff report. And this is pulled out of appendix or attachment I, where we have an implementation attachment for you. So staff at ODOT and DLCD have been concurrently working while we're developing rule language in supporting local governments with funding and technical assistance that they'll need to successfully implement these rules. The executive order directed DLCD and ODOT to make the rule changes to get local plans to meet the targets. And they also directed us to identify means of funding that this will take. The program that we are working under stems from legislative direction. And that has always had the note on it that says meeting the targets will require funding for planning support and for the implementation of the plans. So what we are proposing here is, and this is the draft timeline we're putting out, is that we would be doing regional planning in Salem, Kaiser, Eugene, Springfield areas. Portland Metro has been ongoing work through their regional transportation plan that ties into their Climate Smart Communities project. And what we will need for all areas is performance measures. And so we have been looking at ways to create contracts to get those up and running. One of the key issues, the real foundational element, is climate-friendly areas. Transportation system plans should be designating and zoning these climate-friendly areas prior to work going on to the TSPs. That's really building on what we've learned from the Portland Metro region. They did the 2040 growth concept in the 90s. And that made it a lot easier for them to do their climate plan. And so their Climate Smart Communities plan was built on the foundation of that smart land use package that they put together in the 2040 growth concept. In the near term, we're also looking at doing some parking reform work and then these multimodal inventories. We are working with ODOT to secure a like a state-led contract that will be supporting local governments in getting the multimodal inventories they'll need, both for developing their modal elements of TSPs down the road and also for identifying gaps and corrective actions needed for the performance measures. And so multimodal inventory and TSP updates will just be ongoing work down the road. And Bill, I think we'll talk a little bit more about the difference between what we have to do in the near term to kind of change course a little bit, and then the ongoing work that the rules require. Next slide, please. So the funding we have in hand for support of the rules is DLCD for our current biennium 21 to 23 We have $768,000 in direct assistance grants. Evan Manville and myself are working with local governments for the 15 affected jurisdictions to stand up the grants to support them in identifying the climate-friendly area studies, the phase 1 of that work. It's largely technical analysis, doing the anti-displacement analysis, and also real thorough community engagement. So we're working on that right now. So we'll be ready June 1st to support them in that work when they're ready to go. A couple of years ago when we did the commission charge, it seems like a couple of years now, ODOT had secured $3.5 million to support what we have in the commission charge, and that's the scenario planning requirements for Salem, Kaiser, and Eugene Springfield areas. And you'll remember that Eugene Springfield has already identified a scenario that meets the greenhouse gas reduction target. So we are proposing that they can, and they have, that region has frequently come to the commission and staff and asked that they don't have to repeat that work, that they can use that work. So our rules do say that they can use that plan and then build on top of that to do the necessary local code amendments and TSP updates. And then under that contract, we'd also be doing the performance measures. I'll talk about that later, but for the other metropolitan areas in the state to do the performance-based planning framework. Next slide, please. So we know that this is great. We have this money, but more money is going to be needed to support local governments. DLCD, we are working really diligently on getting a budget request for the next biennium to support the phase 2 of climate-friendly area work. That's the plan amendments and the zoning to do thorough community engagement throughout that phase, and then also for staffing support. ODOT has identified $15 million that the OTC has been weighing on, and tomorrow I think is their final hearing on that, and we expect to have ODOT come to your meeting on Thursday and give you an update on that. That money would be really used for getting the analysis tool enhancements that we need to support the rules. Like I mentioned earlier, those multimodal inventories for all the metropolitan areas, and then supporting local jurisdictions in their transportation system plan updates. Next slide, please. So we also need additional support. DLC and ODOT are looking at staffing requests for direct assistance to communities to getting the grants out. We know that it takes people to put those grants onto the street. It doesn't just, it's not easy to go through the procurement process. And then the guidance and best practices and modeled code language and such that we'll need. We also need, as I mentioned, updates to our analysis and planning tools. A really nice thing that's happened lately is that we've been partnering with Oregon Housing and Community Services to build on the anti-displacement toolkit that the agencies have worked on. And so we're going to be using that in the phase 1 climate-friendly area designation studies. And OHCS has offered to help us getting a map together that we can give to local governments so they can do that spatial analysis, that overlay when they're looking at CFA designations. So that's a really good story there, and we're really thankful for their help and partnership on this. They've also been amending their qualified action plan, their funding allocations for some of their low-income housing tax programs. And so they've made an initial adjustment to the LIHTC program now, and they are open to working with us to, once we have the CFA zoning on the map, to kind of utilizing that as kind of a criteria, not a criteria, but a bonus point for scoring low-income housing. Because we really want to make sure that we're putting low-income housing where people can access all these transportation choices and options and jobs and great neighborhoods that we think we'll see on the ground. DLC, we've also been working with what we have been calling the interagency support team. We were convening groups of different agencies to talk about how they could support local governments in implementation of the rules once we have them. So we are scheduling another meeting of that group in between the commission hearings, and we hope to report back to you in May. The agencies on that group are DEQ, Environmental Quality, Department of Consumer and Business Services, if I got that one right, Oregon Housing Community Services, Department of Transportation, Oregon Health Authority, Oregon Department of Forestry, Department of Energy, and Business Oregon. Bill, I think I might be pitching this back over to you, but I could pause here if there's any other questions. I have one more. Okay, thank you.
I have a comment or question. Sorry. So Cody, do you have any more specifics on the working with the Oregon Housing Agency on the tax credits? I haven't heard much of. I was advocating for this, but I hadn't heard of that it was actually being operationalized. So this is really great news.
Yeah, I will admit that the details of their programs kind of make my head spin, but we have been meeting with them to do a scan for location efficiency scoring for grants that do come in within the metropolitan areas. They have a lot of needs to balance across the state, and so it gets very complex very fast. I think it might be best if we maybe follow up on that, or if you have a specific you'd like us to bring back to the commission meeting, I would be happy to do that. I see Commissioner Lilac, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Cody, my question is, in your coordination with other agencies, is DLCD also seeking funding for infrastructure analysis? As infrastructure planning will be critical both for redevelopment areas as well as for undeveloped areas.
Thank you, Commissioner Lilac. I think to my knowledge, no, but we are undergoing our community engagement for the budget request right now. So we are interviewing RAC members. We're going to do a survey of local governments to see what their needs are to support implementation of the rule, and we'll be hosting listening sessions as well. So we are kind of still in process of figuring out what specifically we need in that budget request.
So Commissioner Lilac, just a follow-up question for you. Were you focusing on non-transportation infrastructure, or do you want to know the coordination relative to the transportation infrastructure?
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. Yes, exactly. I'm just interested in funding beyond transportation, water, sewer in particular, to serve climate-friendly areas, et cetera. Yes, thank you.
Okay, and I think maybe Kevin, you could answer this question a little bit better than I could.
Actually, Cody, I think you've answered it very well. I think that our reaching out to local governments and the input that they provide should help to inform this question. But at this point, there isn't funding identified for that. We're in the process of putting together policy option packages for next biennium, and this could inform that.
If I may, Commissioner Lilac, Regional Solutions is a group of agencies that work on economic development, housing, workforce stuff. And as you probably know, Business Oregon used to have a separate division known as the Infrastructure Finance Authority. That has been melded into the main program of Business Oregon. And of course, the sewer and water infrastructure comes largely federal money through DEQ. Both of those agencies with us and housing and ODOT are a core part of Regional Solutions.
I will make a note and make sure to bring that up with Business Oregon and some of our other sister agencies at that meeting. Thank you. Okay, so getting to implementation of climate-friendly areas, I think this one is like really squarely in DLCD's wheelhouse. A lot of the transportation system planning updates will be run through ODOT with their funding sources. But we are working right now, as I mentioned, Evan and I are standing up preparing contracts for phase 1. And what phase 1 is going to be doing is the community engagement plans. So we're funding and we're creating some template guides, building off the putting people in planning work that the agency has done, which is a really fantastic resource for local governments. So we'll be kind of funding, putting together a community engagement plan that looks over phase 1 and phase 2, not just for phase 1. And then we have put the offer out to look into some of the Eugene, Springfield, Salem, Kaiser, since they have a lot of stuff coming up front. You know, when we saw that chart is looking at what kind of engagement things would you like to be doing over the kind of arc of the rule implementation. We'll be operationalizing the community engagement tasks through the study phase. doing a lot of that technical work, the analysis needed to assess where are you at. Most cities have zoning that would qualify now. We have downtowns, we have mixed use zones already. So kind of figuring out where we are at now, what's the gap, and where might you want to put additional climate friendly areas zoning. Of course, doing an anti-displacement analysis to mitigate any displacement risks by doing a spatial scan, and then also if the risks come up, identifying what potential policies local government might pursue to mitigate those risks, and then culminating with a potential CFAs and a report back to the commission. That will be due in June of 2023, and at which point we are intending to have funding ready to go to support the community engagement tasks, planning and amendment and zoning, and then the impact summary and multimodal gap analysis. Vice Chair Holova. Did you have your hand up? Oh, I can't, you're on mute still.
Thank you about that. I unmuted, but it didn't work. Is the anti-displacement analysis going to be the same tool as the one that's in the housing production strategies work, or is it different?
Yes.
And if so, is the idea that it would be the same tool for all jurisdictions, or jurisdictions would do their own tool? I say tool in the sense of, is there a set definition of this anti-displacement analysis?
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair Holova. Yeah, it is the same toolkit as the housing production strategy, building upon that work toolkit, and then also providing the map to them. So we don't have right now a map that we could just give to a local government, and we want to make sure that it's easy enough for them to do that spatial overlay. So that's what we'll be partnering with OHCS to deliver that map, to do the overlay and funding the analysis with the toolkit. Commissioner Sandoval.
Yeah, thank you, Cody. So in terms of public engagement, so I'm assuming that there's going to be through reading the package, there is going to be an effort to engage underrepresented, underserved communities. I'm just wondering if as an agency we could, or department, we can provide like specific guidance on how to do that. I don't know if it's through best practices or something. So anyways, providing technical kind of assistance for communities to outreach to underserved populations.
Yes, thank you. We are intending on putting out a blueprint that will be kind of centering voices of underserved communities. And Evan, do you want to jump in here? And this is in your house.
No, I think that's right, Commissioner and Cody. Yeah, one of the specific tasks before broader public engagement is engaging underserved voices to hear from them first. And the blueprint will kind of lead people through exactly some options to do that. And the consultants that we're engaging have some experience doing that, and are very much that's a central task that we're paying for. Deputy Director.
Yeah, it's okay. Thanks. Evan and commissioners, I'm just mindful that Commissioner Sandoval is also our liaison to the Citizen Involvement Advisory Committee. So that that group with Sadie as staff support is going to be bringing their work plan to commission this week as well. It's in the commission's packet, but we might suggest that one of the things that CIC helps is in review and comment of the blueprint, Evan. So, as you're developing it, you have a standing body to be very interested, I think, in helping to advise on those best practices and also being brought up to date on what these rules entail, because they're some of the best kept secrets so far. So thank you.
Chairman Carter.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. I think all those ideas are great relative to engagement. So I just want to make sure I understand the pronouns. So when is it each in phase 1 and phase 2? You just described phase 1. Is it each and every community within each of the MPOs that does this? Is it the region that does it? Who is doing this work?
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. It's 15 cities in the county that's identified in the rules, and that is for cities over 5,000 to 10,000 in population have a set of requirements that Kevin will talk about later, and then over 10,000 has a different set of requirements. So it's the cities within the metropolitan areas that are of those population sizes, and it turns out to be 14 cities in Marion County because they have a large portion of unincorporated area with urban services on the east side of Salem.
Thank you.
If I could just clarify, Matt Kroll on the staff at Department of Land Conservation Development. This does not include the Portland metro area. Always important to remember which parts do and do not, because the climate friendly areas, the Portland metro has already gone through a regional centers approach. So it's not doing the climate friendly areas.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, that's the 2040 growth concept with the town centers and that they've done already. So, okay, if there isn't any further questions here, just a reminder, it's attachment I in your packet, and happy to have any conversation on that, but I think it's time to turn over to Bill, talk about timing in the rules.
Thank you, Cody, and Chair and Commissioners. Again, Bill Holmstrom, DLCD staff. We'll talk a little bit about some of the timing issues and what we're doing there, proposing in the draft rules. I think it's important to understand that we're writing these rules to last. They're durable. This agency, we don't go and tweak our rules on a frequent basis necessarily. We've had Division 12, the transportation planning rules, on the books for almost 30 years now. And they've had substantial changes a handful of times in that time. So we expect these rules to stick around for a while, and they are going to set the basis for how these jurisdictions in metropolitan areas do coordinated land use and transportation planning for a long time. So trying to keep that in mind. Understanding that the next few years are going to be a little bit different. They're different than the status quo, what we've been doing in the past. They're different than what is going to be coming. It's a transition time. So a lot of the issues that we are trying to work through are about that transition time. How are we going to get from here to there? We have put together kind of a series of dates, deadlines for that transition time in both divisions 12 and 44. We're going to talk to you a little bit about each of those pieces today. So we've been, I think, trying to work, this has been a big chunk of our work, is trying to kind of calibrate those timing requirements. We came out, I would say we came out pretty hot in a lot of ways. We came out ambitious with our rules and with our timing. And, that's why we have our advisory committees to help us understand, in particular the local governments, how they're actually going to make this work. The statewide planning program is a partnership between the state and local governments, and always important to keep that in mind, that, it's not just us here at DLCD running the statewide planning program. It's a partnership. So working real closely with local governments to try to understand the ins and outs of it. And I'm not saying we're done yet. I think we still have some work to do, but we've tried to make sure that we're balancing flexibility with the urgency that we've been directed to accomplish with these rules. So we know we need to make changes, and they need to happen relatively quickly. The science tells us that, but there's only you can put out rules that won't do anything if you are outlandish or just if they don't make sense. So we're trying to find that sweet spot is what we're trying to do with these rules. And I'm not saying we're perfect, but we're trying to get there. I'm sure you'll hear about this from folks on Thursday, one way or the other. We also have, I think, since we first came out with the rules, learned a lot more about implementation. That's what, Cody just talked to you about, is all the different resources we have, expect to have, or hope to have for implementation, and the time frames that are going to be available for those resources, and realistically what the state will be able to accomplish over certain time frames. And that's informed quite a bit of how we expect to roll out our rules. And then I think another piece that we've been, working on, we've got a lot of cooks in the kitchen. You've got a lot of great staff here working together closely to make these things work. But sometimes, if someone's working on this piece, someone's working on that piece, and, trying to make them sure they fit together and that they're in a coordinated fashion over different divisions. We still are kind of smoothing those pieces and making sure that they're coordinated and make sense to local governments and can be put together in a way that can be sequenced and resourced and successfully implemented so that we actually get to where we're going. So I'll talk real quick, a few slides about Division 12, and then we'll talk about Division 44. And again, Division 12 is the transportation planning rules, which talk about how local governments do coordinated land use and transportation planning. And Division 44 are the rules that include the metropolitan greenhouse gas reduction targets and also guide local governments how they do regional scenario planning. So they're a little bit more regional in scale in general. In Division 12, it's a little confusing. It's Division 12, but then Rule 12 within that division sets out all the timing. And so if you want to find out where all the dates are and all the pieces in that division, it's in Rule 12. We have introduced a few months ago an optional work program that allows local governments to set alternative dates aside from the ones that are set out specifically in the rule. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide, the details about that. But we expect pretty much everybody to take that that option because it really, I think it's a pretty low bar that we're setting to folks to apply for that and have the commission approve it. And that gives them and you and us a lot more flexibility and over the next few years about how these rules are implemented in local governments. Some of our requirements don't necessarily have dates, but they're tied to the jurisdiction's next transportation system plan update. I'll tell you what, I've been working for this agency for 15 years. I was a local planner before that, worked on a county TSP when I was at a local planner, and I've learned more just in the last year or so about how different places do TSP updates that I think I have in that whole time. And there's probably about as many different ways of doing it as there are jurisdictions out there. So we're trying to add some flexibility to making sure that we're accommodating different local governments, different cities and counties and how they work together. Lots of different ways those work too, to make sure that we're providing a path forward for people for jurisdictions to be successful in updating their TSPs in relatively short order. And again, I think this bullet point's important. We expect to make more refinements over the next couple of months. We've received comments, some technical comments in particular, I'd say, from a handful of jurisdictions, which have been useful for us to think about maybe some edge cases and some other pieces that maybe we just need to think through our requirements a little bit more. So we're going to what I like to say, we're going to sand off some rough edges over the next few months here to make sure that we're going to be responsive and have the ability to make this work for everybody. Talk a little bit about the optional work program. The way we've written it right now is it's basically local government comes forward to the commission to say, we would like to do things this order instead, and these are the dates we'd like to do things. And there's a list of the different stuff I'm talking about in the rule, and it's in rule again, Rule 12, and Section 3 of that rule is the section that talks about the work program. They need to be coordinated regionally so that the jurisdictions across the region are talking to each other at least. They can set different dates across the region for when they want to do things, but it has to make sense across the region. They must meet certain criteria, and that includes urgency. So we do say, you need to look and see, is this the fastest you can reasonably make this happen? A lot of this is giving local governments flexibility to maybe push some of these dates back later than they otherwise would be able to meet some of these requirements. And so we want to make sure that they're still balancing that flexibility and urgency. When they send us a work program, that they propose work program, they need to say when they expect to do a TSP update, to update their transportation system plan. We are not requiring a transportation system plan update at a certain date, but we expect that most of them will be updated over the next few years, and we want to understand where that's going to fit in the sequencing of everything that they're trying to do. Just to be clear, we've taken the initial part of the climate friendly area study, that phase one of that column in that slide that Cody showed you. out of something that can be a part of the work program. The timing didn't work out on that. We expected that to happen relatively quickly. We've got the resources to help those 15 jurisdictions do that over the next year. And the work program, by the time a work program comes in, you might be halfway through that period. So it didn't really make sense for it to be in there. We had the resources to do it. We're expecting to do that for all those 15 jurisdictions. So that's not a part of that optional work program. That second phase could be a part of the work program if local jurisdictions wish to do that, to put it in there to make it sequence correctly within other planning work that they're doing. We heard from jurisdictions in the Eugene, Springfield, and Salem Kaiser areas like, hey, you guys are making us we're requiring a work program in Division 44 for jurisdictions in those communities. And we have this other optional work program in Division 12. We're making it very easy for them just to submit one thing to us that covers all the bases, so that we're trying to reduce the amount of things flying around, both from those jurisdictions and then going to the commission as well. And so it's a lot of the same kind of pieces. It's really about phasing, and when all these pieces happen together, they have to be regionally coordinated, and it's a lot of the same stuff. So we're allowing them just to join those together and do it kind of in one stop. And then the final piece, which I think is important to remind folks, is that this work program would be approved by the commission, that they would be submitted, a proposal would be submitted by the local jurisdictions across the region, and it would go to the commission for your approval. And the rule, the way it's written, allows the commission to adjust any of those dates as you see fit at that point, or at any point in the future. If we go along, we find that the work program isn't working for some reason, that we can make adjustments in the future. And Chair, I do see a few hands up.
Yeah, and I don't know who is first. We can call on Commissioner Lilac, and I also have a question after Nick.
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. Two questions, and I'll try not to express my opinion that I'm really appreciative that you created the work plan option, but I will say that. My question, two questions. The first is, I see in the draft rules, the work plan may not be submitted to the department after December 1st, 2022. My question is if the department has thought about maybe March or April of 23. I just think about this in the sense, and I'm just curious because I can imagine that the work plan is the foundation for the entire process. And all this collaboration up front is really going to be critical. And I'm not talking about changing the dates in the future, but I'm just, so that's question number one, is have we thought about giving all of these organizations more time? And some may even need consultants to create the work plan, because it's a major undertaking. My second question is, I see the criteria, the director shall review the proposed work program to make a recommendation to the commission as to whether the proposed work program meets the following criteria. My question is, do all of those criteria have to be met, or is it just one, or is it really discretionary in how those decisions will be made on whether to approve the work plan or not? Thank you.
Chair Arthur, Commissioner Lilac, thank you very much for those questions. I think your first question is about the timing, and again, that's one of those, we were trying to set specific dates. We're trying again to balance the flexibility and the urgency. And if that's something that needs to be pushed back, we can push it back. I think of these work programs as requiring coordination across regions, of course, but the content of the work program is relatively minimal. It's really just different dates and times and sequencing. There's no substance to them really. So when I hear, you just said maybe people have consultants put those together, and and you're not the first person to say something like that. I don't think of it as being that substantive. I think the biggest issue putting those together is going to be the regional coordination and working together, across the region to make those dates make sense. That's going to be the biggest, I think, work task that staff is going to have to be together. But maybe we need to do some clarification, either in guidance or in the rule itself, to clarify that it's the document that we're expecting to receive is not exactly a lengthy or extensive documentation. as least I have conceived of it. So, but if we need to adjust those dates, we can certainly talk about that.
And just before you go on,
Yeah.
thank you. I didn't know it was just dates. I think about a work program as being the entire scope and all the detailed collaboration throughout the entire process. But if it's just dates, then you're right. I'm overthinking it. So I was just curious about that piece of it. That clarity is helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have the rule in front of me. I think we said like basically, which dates do you want to change? That's basically what the work program is. So, but we can review that again just to make sure that it's clear, because like I said, you're not the first person to make that comment or have that kind of question about the work program. So I think we want to be clear about that. Let's see. Your second part of your question was about the criteria. And again, I think, the way I tried to write it was that, the director would make a recommendation to the commission based on those criteria. And then it would be up to the commission to make the decision to accept a work program, to make adjustments to the work program if they felt that was necessary, or to, I suppose, I can't remember what the exact mechanism, or remand that work program back to the region to say, hey, you need to work on this again. But I was trying to keep this process light because, frankly, we want people spending time on the substantive elements and not so much on rejiggering the times when they need to do the different pieces.
So, Bill, I would suggest that we flag this issue because I think I've heard from others about the timing of this work program. So that we don't debate it or discuss it further here. I think on Thursday we should flag this and bring this up again so that the full commission understands what is required as part of that work program. So we understand if it's substantive or dates or whatever. And then we can have, if we feel like we need to provide some guidance on that, we can.
Chair, if I may, just like to add to your list, if you could help us understand a little bit more about what that coordination looks like. Mostly, what if one jurisdiction doesn't want to coordinate and they want to move forward on their own? So just give us an idea of what that all would look like.
Yeah, Chair MacArthur, Commissioner Warren, thank you. I think, we've had questions from jurisdictions basically positing that as well. And I think maybe we can ask you on Thursday what you think that should look like. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thank you, Commissioner Warren, because it reminded me of my second question, and for Thursday, I think is, well, you could probably answer it right now. It is the work program that will be submitted by Salem Kaiser and Eugene Springfield, a work program for all the jurisdictions within those areas and including the MPO, or just the MPO?
So Chair MacArthur, in the case of the optional work programs under Division 12, those are items that need to be accomplished by the individual local governments, by the cities or counties. In the case of the Division 44 work program, those are more regional in scale. And I don't think our rule, and Cody can help me out here, I don't think the rule says the MPO has to do anything in particular, but I think it's trying to lead the horse to water there, if I remember correctly. Cody?
Yes, the requirements are for the cities and counties, and the purpose of that work program is to have them figure out how they would like to interact regionally. Is it something that they would like to do through an MPO? Is it something they would like to set up an IGA or intergovernmental agreement? So it really is a flexible approach. But at the end of the day, all our requirements are really streamlined towards the cities and counties.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And given my continued desire to see a regional perspective, I'd like to talk about this more on Thursday in terms of who needs to kind of sign off and be involved in those particular MPO work programs. So we can leave it until Thursday to discuss further.
And Chair, I think that kind of segues into our next slide, which is about the Division 44 piece of this. And I don't know, Cody, you want to handle this slide?
Sure. So in Division 44, we have a Rule 15, which is the applicability and deadlines. And just Metro, this is not in that rule, but Metro is undertaking their next regional transportation plan. And the way they had came in with the Climate Smart Communities to commission in 2015 was to do ongoing implementation of Climate Smart through their regional transportation plan. So that was what they brought in and the commission accepted at that time. And they do a series of performance measures to show that they're meeting their climate targets. So they're starting work right now. And that'll be coming in, I think it's 2024 is when I think we expect to see it at DLCD and commission. But the timing for the new requirements that we're putting into the proposed rules are for Eugene Springfield to capitalize and use that plan that they came up with in 2015 as part of that same legislative package. And then we have flipped the timing for the local plan amendments. DLCD staff and ODOT staff have been in conversations with the local staff of these two areas, and it made more sense. Salem Kaiser really want to get going on their TSP updates as soon as possible. So we're trying to make sure that we can not get in their way to do that, because we would like them to do that as well. Eugene Springfield, we're okay with kind of doing the plan amendment for the regional plan in the short term because it's mostly there. They need a little bit of time to figure out what it means to implement that plan through their local TSPs. So giving them a little bit more time to think about that and get to those local plan amendments. But in Salem Kaiser, it would be kind of doing a concurrent look on regional planning to meet the targets and what the local TSP amendments would be. And so that's the dates in the plan now that have changed just a little bit. And then these are not optional, these are required to come in with a work plan. So the work plan option Bill was talking about was, if you would like to do that, you can do that. In Division 44, we're saying, here's the dates in which you need to bring in a work plan. Tell us what you need, tell us how you want to work together. And DLCD and ODOT staff will be helping out, and we're already having conversations with them to try to figure out how to do this work. Okay.
So thank you, Cody, and thank you, Chair. That's, I think, all the slides we have on timing, unless the Commission has any other questions on that topic.
I don't see anyone's hand up.
Right. So thank you. I think I'm going to hand it back to Cody. I think it's the Cody and Bill show so far. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I think it's more of the Bill sandwich. So we're going to talk about some of the changes to the rules of Division 44, meeting our greenhouse gas targets and reducing or demonstrating reductions in VMT per capita in the TPR rules. And I have a couple slides. They're pretty texty, but I promise you I have a couple graphic slides at the end of this wall of text I'm about to throw at you. Your staff report has a discussion on these issues we're going to talk about now on page 11 and 12. So there's kind of the narrative right up there. The last time we talked about different ideas for regional planning, and the phrase I coined was like the regional something. We really went back and we looked hard at a lot of the comments that were coming in, and we looked back at the rules in Division 44 and just came to the conclusion as joint agency staff that the rules are really flexible, and intentionally so, on how folks work together to do the regional planning. I think in a lot of ways, what people are reading into this is the experience that Portland Metro had in going through their scenario planning, and they use that as the kind of stereotype for what the scenario plan is. But I think it's important to remember that when Portland Metro did their scenario planning, no one in the state had done it before. And we did not have the statewide transportation strategy. So they were really figuring it out as they were undertaking that work. What we have now is we've gone through the statewide transportation strategy, which has identified the kind of levels of actions that metropolitan areas of different sizes would have to take to meet the targets. And that really provides a lot of foundational work that we can draw from. So if a region wanted to just adopt the default scenario, they could do that and skip a lot of the work. But if they said, well, we want to kind of do it our own way, we're special and we think we want to place more emphasis on walking and biking rather than transit, then you can do that. But you just have to figure out how it all equals up to meeting your greenhouse gas reduction target. So it really provides a flexible approach. And I think Bill said earlier, we're really trying to balance the need for urgency and the need for implementing these rules in the short term. And what we came to the conclusion was that we've been doing this work. We've been doing the scenario planning through Portland Metro ongoing since 2012. Eugene Springfield has done it. We have a voluntary process that we've worked with doing scenario analysis, that we've worked with the Rogue Valley area. We worked with Corvallis in 2 different phases. And then we just recently, just in the last year, actually completed a project with the Albany area. So we have a lot of the information and the tools that are already spun up and ready to go that we can support tomorrow. Basically, I mean, that might be putting it a little too far, but we can start day one when these come down, that we know we have the tools, we know how to do this, and we have a program. So we're proposing to keep the rules in Division 44 as proposed, and that is consistent with the commission charge we've been working with. We did clarify back in TPR, that second line there, Division 12, that Portland Metro meets their targets through their regional transportation plan. So that's really just kind of codifying what they're already doing. So we've worked with their staff, and that's what they intend to do, and we want to put that out there. And we know that Portland Metro has light rail, and they have skyscrapers, and they have things that other metropolitan areas that they can set a higher bar, and that's consistent with some of our previous rulemaking with them, is to have a little bit higher bar for the Portland Metro. Their targets are a little bit higher than the other MPOs in the state in our rules, because just recognizing that ability. So we do kind of codify that we have a little bit of a higher bar there. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to jump over here to Division 12. Oh, I see a hand up. Commissioner Warren.
Just a quick question, and I'm mostly responding to a question from Matt Brinkley of City of Medford about kind of a standardized methodology for the VMT modeling. What I just heard you say is we kind of have that already in place, but can you confirm that for me?
We have a standardized method to meet the GHG reduction targets in Division 44. And that's, I frequently call a target rule calculation. So that's how to do the modeling to say, here's how you do VMT reduction, greenhouse gas reduction in a regional scenario planning process. When we talk about reducing VMT or calculating VMT, there's a lot of different flavors of VMT, and it is used in a lot of different planning aspects with a lot of different definitions. What we are proposing is to align the definition for the purposes of the TPR in the metropolitan areas with the definition of VMT that has been in Division 44. And that is a household-based travel for any household living within a metropolitan area, and some of the commercial services that might be associated with household travel, such as, nowadays, Amazon fleets and things like that. So, and that's regardless of where those households might drive. So they might leave the metropolitan area, but the previous version of the TPR, this is going to get real wonky real fast. The previous draft that we are amending had a much different definition of VMT that was based on internal trips only. And so it was only the trips that begin and end in a metropolitan area. It was very different from the modeling that most folks were doing. And so it required a separate process from the planning work that was done. And so you wouldn't be surprised to find out that wasn't successfully implemented, because people were like, oh, we have to do this special thing. We have to request money, and we have to pull out these things from the models. So we're really trying to streamline things and get down to a common definition of VMT for the purposes of DLCD rules, specifically Division 44 and Division 12. Okay, so when I say VMT here, I just want to remind, it's VMT per capita. So it's the vehicle miles traveled per capita. Let's see, Rule 160 is where we had requirements for reducing VMT through local transportation system planning. And so the previous draft rules that we had out there asked for the unconstrained project list. So the project lists that happen regardless of funding. We know there's a lot of projects, a lot of needs out there. They're all kind of captured in a plan. That they would meet the greenhouse gas reduction targets in VMT reductions necessary to achieve those, either giving cities the option to do it as a city alone to demonstrate that, or kind of, as Bill said, leading the horse to water and saying, hey, we want you to work regionally, and if you can do that, that would be great. So you have an option to do it that way. We are now recommending that those TSPs, that we remove that requirement from Rule 160. We've had a lot of comments come in through League of Oregon Cities and local governments and some of the transportation modeling community. I'm just flagging that the projects on the illustrative lists aren't fully developed. They might just be kind of ideas on a paper, and we kind of have a general sense, but we don't really know what specifically is in that project. And there's a lot of them. So it really is creating a pretty steep bar to have folks put those through the model to show this reduction. And we know that we have regional targets. They're set up for a regional planning framework. They don't connect. You don't just divide them by 2 for each city. That they have different scales, and we have something that we know works. So we're proposing to dial that back down. We do still want to keep the requirement that transportation system plans demonstrate an overall decrease in the vehicle miles traveled per capita through their constrained project list. So that's the project list that is constrained by the amount of funding that they are projected to have available over the planning horizon. And in the rules, we mentioned the fleet fuel technology from state and federal actions. And I've gotten some questions from local staff on that, and just want to remind folks why we had that in there in the first place is because that's part of a target rule calculation. When folks are doing the modeling to show they're meeting the GHG targets, those targets are set with local actions plus state and federal ambitious actions. So we have not had cap and trade in the state, but the targets assume, because the STS assumes that cap and trade will be here. DEQ has recently passed the climate protection plan, which is going to get us towards carbon pricing. So those are the things that we now are chipping away at, but there's still things in there that we don't have on the books yet. And so that's why we said, if you're doing VMT reductions through the constrained project list, assume what you normally do assume, and that's the business as usual scenario. What is reasonably likely to be here in the planning horizon. So if you can make the case that DEQ has this climate protection plan and the cost of fuel is going to go to something, then that's reasonable. But if there's something that nobody's working on and we don't have any idea of the planning horizon that'll be there, then we're asking just for business as usual assumptions. Chair MacArthur.
Yeah, thank you, Cody. I just want to make sure it's a great explanation, and I want to make sure I understand it. And also for those that aren't as familiar with TSPs, transportation system plans, that we kind of understand what you're kind of the frame of what you're saying. So in a TSP, a system plan for transportation, there's out of that process of developing that, there is an unconstrained list of projects and a constrained list. And the constrained list are those projects that are expected to be built sometime in the next 20 years. And the reason they're constrained is because a jurisdiction has to figure out what kind of funding sources they have in hand and what can be expected in the next 20 years to fund those projects. That defines the full dollar amount for the constrained projects. And so you're saying that for constrained projects, there is a VMT reduction requirement for that compilation of constrained projects. Is that correct?
That's correct. Thank you. That's a good synopsis.
And then for the unconstrained list, which is beyond the 20 years potentially, or it's just a big monster project that might be done sooner if there's magical money that comes from wherever, but generally it's projects that are in the very, very long term. And so there is no longer a VMT reduction target for the unconstrained list, correct?
Yes.
And then my question then is, what are we requiring of how much of a VMT reduction target is there in the rule for each jurisdiction that is going to be doing their TSP?
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. The rule as written now, we're saying that overall, transportation system plans need to come in that show a reduction. There's no target reduction to get the plan adopted. So we want to make sure that we are in general adopting plans that decrease VMT, but there isn't a target. So we do have the regional planning framework, and I'm going to show you in a little bit, a couple slides here, how we're connecting the TSPs to the targets. So let me maybe answer that in a couple slides.
Yeah, and a couple slides would be good. And then I think we probably should flag this issue for commission consideration on Thursday. So just FYI.
So quickly, the last two lines on this slide are we put in a couple exemptions. So one is to exempt cities who are trying to adopt a TSP that has project lists that don't contain any projects that would require the enhanced review of select roadway projects. So if they're not doing on their constrained list projects that would be increasing roadway capacities, then we don't think that you would have to model this stuff. It's up to you, but that's an exemption. And we also just recognize that a lot of smaller cities going to really struggle with this, and that we're really saying, if you're less than 5,000 if you're less than 5,000 in population, that you wouldn't be subject to this requirement. And then for cities between 5 and 10, you can request an exemption, and that could be granted by the department. We'll see the next slide is, okay, so how do we demonstrate the reductions in VMT to meet our targets? So I do have a graphic on this, but just we have these in rule and we want to keep them. Getting project lists that have prioritization factors. So you have 100 projects on your project list. Which ones are the most important? Which ones we pull from first? Well, we've had this in the rule for some time now, is asking cities and counties to come up with prioritization factors that include VMT reductions, benefits and burdens on underserved population, and then meeting their climate and equity performance targets. So in the rules 900, we're really setting up a performance-based planning system that's really centered on climate and equity. And I just want to mention now that that is really to give the information that's needed to buy down climate emissions and buy up equity. So we want them to go through and look at the actions they'll need to meet the greenhouse gas reduction targets and increase equitable outcomes. And then over time, monitor and report on what are the actions they've taken, what are the gaps that are still there, and then what corrective actions might they need to pull that up. And then again, we put in that exemption for smaller cities. Let's see, the next couple more slides. I'm probably taking up too much time here. Let's skip over this one. Next slide. You'll know that. Yeah, so what I was just discussing was how do we connect the local plans to our targets? That's through the prioritization factors. So selecting projects to go onto the constraint list that meet greenhouse gas reduction targets. So getting the VMT reduction, looking at equitable outcomes, and then monitoring and reporting every 4 or 5 years, depending on when their MPO regional transportation plan cycle is. Some are 4, some are 5. So the rules say you should report in those years that you have an RTP coming in. So to really monitor and report on those actions, and that's the performance-based planning system in Rules 900. And a part of that is identifying the necessary corrective actions. When you have a large gap, what are the things you need to do as a city to fill that gap in getting mixed use areas near transit, or getting more bike level of low stress travel networks in your community. Now let's see, next slide is the graphic where we have kind of proposing 2 paths here. So to meet our greenhouse gas targets, we have the regional scenario planning on the left, which is something we've been doing and we know how to do. And we're asking for 2 more metropolitan areas to do this work. It's setting up the plan as a region, and then getting to what are the regional performance targets, and then the local actions for each city and county. What are the actions they'll need to take to set those performance targets? And then those could be implemented through local plans. And so that's really what Metro has been doing over the course of their regional planning. They report on the progress on the actions they take to meet the greenhouse gas reduction target. They don't calculate the greenhouse gas reduction target every time they do that. On the second track, what we're talking about for Bend, Albany, Corvallis, Grants Pass, and the Rogue Valley would be ODOT staff is working on a contract, so we can put out for RFP to do a regional assessment, essentially where we're looking at the local plans, very similar to our strategic assessment framework, and saying what's the gap between what you have on the plans now and where your targets are, and then what would be the performance measures you need to pull up. What are the gaps for each of these different performance measures that are listed in rule, I believe it's 910, to get there. And so then they can adopt those in their transportation system plans and go through the monitoring and reporting framework. I got one more slide here with a graphic, and still happy to take questions as they come up. Just wanted to refresh the commission with what we're proposing in Division 12. The transportation planning framework is the modal elements are kind of the foundation of the TSP, that we're looking at inventory and the complete system that would be needed for bike, ped, transit, streets and highways, and transportation option programs. And that's in the rules 500 to 830 generally. And then in rule 170, you kind of combine those into what are the total needs for all the transportation modes, and combine those into multimodal projects if that happens to align. So if you have a bike system and a street network project on one corridor, you would kind of combine those and look for opportunities to enhance those. And then getting to the unconstrained project list, and we're asking for cities and counties to rank those by tiers, to say what are kind of the immediate needs, what are the middle priority needs, and what are the kind of low priority needs. And using that prioritization factors, VMT reductions, benefits and burdens to priority populations, and then how are you meeting your performance targets to achieve your greenhouse gas goals. And then when you get into the constrained project list in Rule 180, still looking for those prioritization factors, still looking for projects to be funded off of the list that reduce VMT, that meets funding. The constrained list has got to meet the available funding, and then selecting projects to meet desired outcomes of benefits and burdens to priority populations and meeting the greenhouse gas performance targets.
So Cody, is one of the reason why the VMT requirement basically in the draft rule is just you have to reduce VMT. Your financially constrained list has to reduce VMT without a number by it or a percent by it, a percent reduction by it. Is one of the reasons for that because these projects will be prioritized not only on VMT reductions, but also on equitable benefits and burdens, as well as progress toward other performance targets?
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. Yeah, there's a lot of a need for doing equity work, and there's a lot of need for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And there's also a lot of need to get this program up in the near term. And for us, we've consistently, as staff said, if we want to set greenhouse gas performance targets for local cities on their TSPs, we would need some time to do that. We would need to go through that exercise and get the tools and everything aligned to do that. So what we have on the books and as a program are setting up and fully supporting our greenhouse gas performance work at the region. So it would take some time, and we feel like we would prefer as staff to use the tools we have in our toolbox than to go back and build new tools in that toolbox, because it's going to take time either way. There's no free lunch, essentially.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And when in looking over some of the comments that people have, various interest groups have submitted, this is an issue that they've raised about the level of VMT reduction. So I would suggest also flagging this, and you might have been planning to do that anyway, but to have this conversation on Thursday as well, so we understand the context before hearing verbal testimony.
Thank you.
And Cody, I was hoping you could walk us through the equity analysis in 0135. And then also, since we have this beautiful framework here, by the way, up, where does that fit into this framework?
Okay, good question. The equity analysis in Rule 135 is something that I guess I would see it as overarching of the development of a transportation system plan. So it is really convening an advisory committee that's placing an emphasis on centering the voices of underserved populations. And really, when you're looking at this framework here, is when you get down to those bottom circles, how are you improving benefits and having less burden on underserved populations? So you need to go through that conversation to figure it out, right? They have to tell you, yeah, that's going to be a real burden on my neighborhood when you build that highway and tear down all these homes. That's a pretty extreme example, but there are things that we need to have those conversations with, and we need to create space to ask those hard questions while we're doing the updates in this plans. I don't know if that answers your first question enough. We don't have a slide on that. So is it something where, would you like us to come back to that on Thursday?
I think it might warrant a broader conversation. I remember the RAC, creating this equity analysis, but I'm also wondering how local jurisdictions will be able to perform it. As it's written right now, to me, it seems, well, not going to go into that. It seems like it would be useful if jurisdictions, if we could have, trying not to put what I think out there. Do we have a model set up for jurisdictions to use to do an equity analysis besides what's in the rule, I guess?
Well, that's a great question, Commissioner Warren. We built the rules of the equity analysis rules based on the racial equity toolkit that's in place with a number of jurisdictions across the nation. So in state, Portland is doing this work. They've gone through that. We kind of looked a lot at like what the city of Seattle was doing in their, what they call the racial equity toolkit in Seattle. But just a quick Google search will, there's a ton of communities across the nation that are doing this work. And that's the basic steps in section 2 of Rule 135. We also learned a lot from what the city of Bend was doing. Some very similar work here. So that was something we felt that could be replicated in Rule. And the intention was to have it flexible enough to where cities could figure out how that applies best to them, but to kind of, these are the key steps in going through that, the key questions you need to ask with that advisory committee.
Any follow-up, Commissioner Warren?
No, thank you, Cody. That's super helpful.
Commissioner Lilac.
Thank you, and Commissioner Warren, thank you for raising it. This is one of the issues I had questions about today as well. And so I'll just keep this to a question. Under 2B and C, assess, document, acknowledge, and address where past policies and effects of climate change have harmed and are likely to perpetuate harm to underserved populations. That's B. And then C, assess, document, acknowledge, and address where current and past racism has harmed and continues to harm underserved populations. I really agree that we really need to understand what you're expecting, what the state's expecting from cities, because that can be a color of law book, it can be a master's thesis, or it can be, let's document with some level of analysis, like findings in a staff report. This could be a monumental undertaking, and I think it's helpful for local governments to understand what the expectation is. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lilac. Evan, do you want to weigh in on this, or Deputy Director Green?
Go. Yeah, I mean, I think we built this in response to, in partnership with our rulemaking advisory committee and their equitable outcome statement. And I think that as we're moving towards fleshing out the implementation, we are realizing people could read this in different ways. So I think that we're seeing value in a limited application of this, having a government acknowledge this, and as resources allow, to flesh that out. But it is we understand that it's not clear in the language currently, the level, and we'll have to provide some guidance on that. Deputy Director.
No, thank you. I think that's just it. In that this is a new world for it's a new world, but an overdue world. I think commissioners would agree that we absolutely need to be clear about, you know, what some best practices are, what the expectations are. So I just appreciate commissioners expressing some inquiry and concern about this. As with these entire rules, new and different is still hard, even if it's right. So we absolutely need to provide the support and the kind of cohort of learning that goes along with this, not to be punishing, but to be moving from a place of shared learning and really accountability to doing things better. Thanks.
Commissioner Sandoval.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the city of Oakland has some really interesting ones. I don't know if you looked at those, but yeah, they actually, you know, have like indicators and metrics and so forth that you can measure. And then the other thing is, I'm sorry, but can you on the packet, can you tell me where the equity analysis is? I can't find it. Couldn't find it.
So I have it up here. We are looking at Rule 135. It's attachment F, Division 12, and it's page 46 of that attachment. And if you go to the PDF page number, it's 47.
Okay, hang on, Cody, do that. If you don't mind doing that again slow, I'm gonna do it as well. So go ahead, because we have giant packets. So go ahead and the attachments are not, they're labeled, but they're not internally page numbered. So can you just do that again?
Sure. It's attachment F of your packet, and that's the Division 12 rule.
Okay, so just pause there. that takes a while. Hang on. This is really important. As we're doing shared learning, there's only one way to do this, is to make sure that we're all on the same page.
If it'd be helpful, I could put the rule language up.
Did you say it was page, you know how it says X of 105? Did you say it was page 46?
Yes, it's page 46 of 105.
Oh, good. They are internally numbered. Thank you, Commissioner. Thanks, Vice Chair. So that does speed it up. Commissioner Sandoval, I'm not sure if you have your hard copy in front of you, but that I did find it. So when you're with your hard copy, that was easy to find.
Okay, perfect. No, I have it here. So yeah, thanks so much.
Awesome. Okay. And then Commissioner Sandoval, if I could just ask a follow-up question. You had mentioned a city, but I didn't catch the name.
Oh, Oakland?
Which one?
Yeah.
Oakland.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So I think this is helpful to have the direct references. Thanks for asking the question. Do you have a follow-up question, Commissioner Sandoval?
No, thank you.
But given the collective interest in this, both from us as well as, you know, sort of direction and guidance to local jurisdictions, again, I think this is something that we should review, that staff should review with us on Thursday. I'm trying to kind of keep track of issues as we go. I'll summarize them at the end. You guys can populate it further, but that was one thing. I had that similar question. So rather than go over it and use your time this way, I think that the public would like to know about that as well, and our partners.
Okay, Chair MacArthur, I'm done with my presentation here on that section. So if there are no further questions, I'll turn it back over to Bill.
Any other questions, commissioners, at this point for Cody? Really nice presentation. Your graphics have gotten better and better, and it's really easy to understand now. So thank you. Not that it wasn't before. It's just complicated stuff, but thank you. Okay, Bill.
So thank you, Chair MacArthur. And we talked just a couple slides on bicycle network, and you know, I know you received a number of comments on that. previously. And so I just want to go over a little bit about where we're heading with that and why we've made some decisions that we've made. So just real quick, I want to talk about what the requirements are in the draft rules right now, and for our bicycle network standards. We ask local governments to inventory facilities in key locations. Cody mentioned that's something that particularly that pedestrian and bicycle facilities inventories may be a piece of something that we're able to fund statewide and do kind of a help local governments out with inventorying those out in those important locations. We are asking, this is kind of the key piece here, we're asking local governments to plan for a connected network of safe, low stress, direct and comfortable bicycle facilities that are for all ages and abilities and that connect key destinations. And I've got my next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the network. That the facilities need to be planned using the context of the streets that they go along. And we've got busy streets with lots of traffic, that those bicycle facilities have a higher level of protection from the motor vehicle traffic. And then also the other piece of these rules, and this rule 630 talks about bicycle parking, and make sure that when you get to your destination, you've got a place to put your bicycle. So we have some enhanced requirements there as well. We've had requirements about bicycle parking in the TPR for decades, and these are a step up from what we've had in the past. So a lot of the more comments that we've received have been really about that connected network and making sure that we have strong requirements that really lay out what our expectations are for local governments. We've been able to update our draft to add a definition of all ages and abilities and really lay out what the expectation is for facilities that meet that are comfortable for all ages and abilities, and that helps, I think, set the standard for local governments to say, hey, this has got to be open for kids, this has got to be open for people who are aged, people who have disabilities. There's a whole long list of what all ages and abilities means now that we've put in the rule, and so we're pretty proud that we've been able to do that piece of it. I think that the stickier part of it is you've received a number of comments, I think, from folks that say, hey, just adopt the NACDO standards. NACDO is the National Association of City Transportation Officials. They have lots of great publications. They've done lots of good work about how do you do really international level types of bicycle, and they have other, they do a transit and pedestrian as well, but international level types of facilities in the United States context. And so they have a publication called what is it called? The Design for Urban Bikeways. I can't remember the exact title. It's in your staff report. But we've been trying to figure out how to make that work. The problem is that there's an existing document. It's the second edition of that guidebook, and we could write in our rules. We could say an option for local governments is to adopt standards that are consistent with the second edition of this guidebook. The third edition of that guidebook is due next year. We can't say point at the third edition yet because it doesn't exist. But we can't just say use the most recent version because that would be unlawful. We recently had a conversation with Steve Shipsey with the Department of Justice last week, or the week before, I guess it was, with staff, trying to kind of figure out what the sideboards are on that. And it's tough because the way the law is written, you as the commission can't delegate your rulemaking authority to somebody else. So if you are setting a standard and you can make a reference to a specific standard, that's okay. But if you say, well, just do what those people say, well, what if those people come along and say, well, do something completely different? That's not what the commission intended. That could happen. So that's why that's illegal. And I'm not a lawyer, but that's the way I understand it. And if you've got more questions about this, Mr. Shipsey will be available, I imagine, on Thursday to answer questions about that. So I think we're in a spot where we could say use a standard which we know is going to be outdated pretty soon. And we talked with some ODOT people about this as well. And the first thing they told me is, well, don't put a specific edition in there because you'll be stuck with it, as we've been stuck with our rules for 20 years on these things. And like that's the problem. We have to use a specific reference in the rules, and that's the problem that they have too. So we're trying to walk a line here where we're trying to set out what our expectations are without being too specific, so that times change. We wouldn't have used obviously the same guidance now that we would use 10, even 15 years ago. So I think the approaches that we're going to take is we're going to try to set out with the all ages and abilities, which I think helps a lot in terms of setting out who we expect to use these facilities, which has a connotation to them, right? Like if it's these types of folks using these facilities, it's got to be a pretty nice, a pretty comfortable facility. And make the specific references within the guidance where we have a lot more flexibility in terms of what we can reference, and we can update that easier as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions about that. I say, Chair, you've got your hand up, Chair McCarthy.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. I think you and staff have done a nice job of taking some language that probably, I haven't looked at the NACDO standards specifically, but some of that language and tried to place it into the draft rule. I think this is something we should flag for Thursday, because if the commission leans toward, and we're not going to discuss it now, but if the commission is leaning toward embracing, encompassing, whatever the term is, the full NACDO, the most current version, so to speak, of NACDO standards. I mean, there is precedent for figuring out the right wording in rule, because I recall one of the first things I remember when I was first on the commission, the sage grouse rules, they reference a document that changes over time, if I recall correctly, and we're able to do that. So there's, if in fact, I think we should talk about it on Thursday. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm happy for you to have that conversation with Mr. Shipsey, because we had that conversation, and we tried to come at it from every direction. And
okay.
So, yeah.
I'm sure you did. I'm not implying you have done. I think you've done everything you possibly can, and maybe there's no way to encompass it, or maybe there's a different way to reference it. I don't know, but I think some folks have an interest. I'm not implying. We should talk about it without going further today. I don't want to comment on my particular preference, but I think that issue is out there and people have raised it. So we should have a public conversation about it where people can testify on that point.
So in the interest of time, I think I'm going to hand it over to Evan to talk about electric vehicle charging. We still need to talk about EV charging and CFAs. We've got about half an hour left, so I want to make sure that we save time.
Thank you, Bill. Evan Manville, he, him pronouns. Climate mitigation planner here at the agency. So I noted this in a previous meeting, that our electric vehicle charging provisions have dramatically changed after our conversation with attorneys at Building Codes and Mr. Shipsey. So just wanted to clarify what has happened. And pretty much it's that because the legislature set up some boundaries on EV charging and said Building Codes was going to be in charge of them, those boundaries are pretty much like what the state can, or what the state can do. And so they limited EV charging requirements to certain development types, privately owned things. They're talking only about new buildings, so we can't touch retrofits. There may be a slight opening in those parking areas that aren't pertinent to buildings, so aren't attached to a building, so a standalone parking lot. We're kind of looking into seeing whether we should encourage some EV charging there. They also defined electrical service capacity in a strange way. Well, in a way, the legislature did, which said, hey, just find a place that you can put in electrical service capacity, and that's as well as conduit. And that's okay if you have a location, you've got capacity, and in theory, that's capacity for future stuff, but it's actually, it's not requiring transformer sized at a certain thing or something. The last bit it did do, that law, which is now RS 455-417, is say, hey, by a process concerning land use, so you could mess around with a 20%. of spaces that the EV is charged. So that is a nod, according to the attorneys, that hey, this bit is a land use thing, and the commission can consider rules on that. So that's where the rules are focused. It's focused on the 20% of capacity, which again is a location plus conduit. So next slide.
I have a question, Chair. I don't understand what that 20% is in reference to.
Yeah, sorry. My last revision to the slide made 15 minutes before this meeting apparently didn't get through. So apologies.
Or maybe it's here. Maybe it's on this page.
Yeah, and maybe so. It's about the number of spaces that have to be served, Vice Chair Halova, and be served by conduit for EV charging. And so
Can I ask a question real quick? Sorry. Mm-hmm. The number of spaces that need a conduit, just a conduit, that's it. Nothing else.
That is correct.
Okay.
The conduit and the theoretical space to put the charger in, but the wiring is not included. The charging station is not included. The transformer is not included. It's just saying that this is the stuff that, as you're building a new building, put this in now. It's the most efficient time. The rest of it you can retrofit pretty easily as demand increases. So,
do you mind going back one slide real quick? I thought I had another question, but now I've forgotten.
Bill?
I think I'm good. Thank you.
Sure. So the highlighted part is really kind of where we're going beyond the statute, or going into our place where we have authority. And it's really focused on that residential and mixed use development and saying, hey, let's say, all right, 50% of spaces overall have to have charging. So the 20% that's in the statute, let's go beyond that and say, all right, half of spaces have to have very basic charging. Or if you have faster charging that manages, which is level 2, or if you have super fast, you can just install for that. So that's kind of what we have in the current EV charging provisions. It's not a lot. And again, we are looking at possibly standalone parking lots as one more provision that we might have authority over, but just wanted to clarify where that went, why it went.
Sorry, Evan, I remember my question. That would be helpful. Sorry.
Sure.
It says for 5+ dwelling units. If that 5+ dwelling units has no parking at all, does this not apply? Or are we saying we have to provide charging stations even if it just says 5+ units? It doesn't say anything about 5+ parking spots or.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the language now. So it's 20% of nothing. It's based on the number of parking spaces. So 20% of nothing would be nothing.
Okay.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
I have 2 quick questions. First, is the March 31st, 2023 deadline, is that in statute? Is that why we have that date? That's one question. And then my second question is, it states, related to that, it states cities and counties shall implement the requirements for electrical vehicle charging. Does that mean adopt into local code, or what does implement mean in that context? And in full disclosure, I have one. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lilac. That is a draft in the rule. That's not anything to do with the state law. And the thought is that the local jurisdictions would amend their codes by then to require developments after March 31st, 2023 to include the conduit as specified in 410 of the draft rules.
And I had another question. Does that 5+ dwelling units, that applies to home ownership or just rental?
It applies, it just mirrors the statutory language. So it's about multifamily dwelling units or multi-use that has 5 residential or units.
Okay, and the 5 is fixed.
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay.
Well, we can't go below it. We could go above it, I think, if we want to say 10+ units, but we can't do the 1 to 4 dwelling units.
Yeah. Okay. I won't say anything.
Thank you, Vice Chair Holloway.
Lots of thoughts. Okay.
That's where we are with EV charging. and we let our partners who helped craft the language that know that we pass that on to building codes, and it's in the record if the legislature revisits this issue. But, next slide. Yeah, presuming that those were the questions. So in parking reform, just really quickly, continue to make small adjustments and corrections. Really appreciate the detailed testimony of our partners, both local planners involved in Oregon APA, like City of Salem planner and former Gresham planner and that sort of folk, as well as our partners in Eugene and Springfield. So we're making small tweaks, but nothing I think is super consequential, and generally headed the same direction as we were headed. We have certainly heard some concern over the provisions, particularly from Sherwood and Cornelius, and I am planning to go out there in mid-April to do a site visit, meet with folks, kind of do some utilization studies that they said they haven't yet done. So trying to really understand and make sure that it's a data-driven policy, but trying to be open and continue that conversation. So that's where we're on parking reform, if people have questions. Otherwise, I'll pass it on.
Can you expand very small, very little, not much, on the remove the off-street parking? That one.
Sure, if you can go back a slide. An earlier draft of the rules said that cities had to amend their codes to give credit for on-street frontage parking. And we heard some concerns from cities that that's kind of hard to manage and was more trouble than it was worth. And so in respect to the cities, I said we can move that over to guidance.
Thank you.
Yep. Kevin.
Thank you, Evan. All right, I'm going to step through some of the changes to the climate-friendly area portions of the rules. Not a lot here, but this slide kind of outlines the changes that have been made based on input that we've received. Firstly, the minimum dimensional standard has been revised. So this is the width of a climate-friendly area, so the zoned area. Previously, the rule said the small cities, 5 to 10,000, the minimum dimension was 500 feet, then expanded to 1,000 feet for the larger cities. As we kind of heard feedback and thought through the idea that we might have neighborhood centers as CFAs, so maybe some smaller areas, we looked at the math, looked at 750 by 750 feet is basically a 13-acre area, and that seemed to be, about that. That would be about as small as a CFA could be, and that seemed to be okay, just in terms of to get a critical mass of activities, but not too small. So that's why we amended the dimension there, and that would apply for all cities. So that's for the smallest cities, 5 to 10,000, and all the larger cities as well. We also amended the rules to allow for cities to designate climate-friendly areas outside city limits, but within their urban growth boundaries under certain conditions. This was in response to some feedback we heard about some great candidate areas for climate-friendly areas. The conditions really get at things like contiguity and serviceability of these areas, because what we don't want to see are the designation of climate-friendly areas that are, in a portion of the UGB that's not likely to be served for many, many years. We need this development to occur quickly within the near future, and so we want to make sure that this provision would result in successful CFA, development. Another change we made was to that study requirement. So in the first year, the local governments are required to study potential climate-friendly areas. And one component of that now is amended to include a community engagement plan, which I believe Cody mentioned earlier on, is a community engagement plan, not just for that first year, but for years 1 and 2. So this is the whole process from the study of potential climate-friendly areas, the equitable outcomes analysis, the looking at displacement, looking at different areas where a climate-friendly area might or might not make sense through the zoning and comp plan process, which would be the land use decision process. Please remember, year 1, the study is not a land use decision, so it is not a. There's not a formal decision that would occur, just submittal of the study at the end of year 1. And as was noted previously, the study phase was not included in the work plan option. So we pulled that out in part because we have the resources to support that work. We also think that getting the land use piece settled early on is very important. And so since we are able to support the local governments in doing that work, we made that change as well. Another change we made was to block length. And this has been, I think we've gotten a lot of input on what the block length standard should be. So I think our last draft had 350 feet. We had some concerns expressed with that. And so what we've done is move that maximum block length to 500 feet, but requiring a pedestrian through connection if that block length is more than 350 feet. A couple of things kind of inform that decision. First of all, I looked at the downtown areas of the 8 largest cities within each of the 8 regions in Oregon, kind of got a sense of those existing downtown areas, what kind of block lengths are we looking at? And generally what I found is most of them are in the range between 200 to 400 feet. So they're kind of, at least in those larger cities, they're kind of in the range that we're looking for, which is good news. And the reason that we put in the pedestrian connection requirement versus just an absolute 350 block length standard is the concern is that if we put a 350-foot block length requirement in rule, practically speaking, that requires with redevelopment in an existing area, dedication of right-of-way and improvement of right-of-way, which at a minimum can be quite expensive, but also realistically can serve to impede or in some cases maybe rule out the development that we want to see in these climate-friendly areas. And so that pedestrian connection option provides a little more flexible approach to meeting that standard. The last change that we made is to allow Metro and the local governments within the Metro region to use the transportation review process that's allowed for climate-friendly areas. So as you recall, rather than the significant effect test in Rule 0060, this transportation review process requires a multimodal infrastructure gap summary, and in some cases, a highway impact summary. All right, I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. Okay, I also know that we've received quite a lot of testimony about housing supply. Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Warren, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, Kevin, thanks. So I'm just picturing how this block length thing is going to play out. Because most of the places that are going to become CFAs, climate-friendly areas, are already built out. So that block length will not be adjusted unless there's redevelopment, right? Okay, just want to make that really clear because we've gotten a lot of pushback on that.
Yes, you're correct, Commissioner Warren. It is conceivable that some fast-growing cities may designate climate-friendly areas in areas that have yet to develop, in which case, the street infrastructure block length can be decided, and set out of whole cloth. But in most cases, you're right, it's going to come with redevelopment. All right. So in terms of housing, and the changes that we've made to the housing rule, just a reminder that this is in Division 8. And what we've really striven to do, and I will definitely cover this in some depth at our meeting on Thursday, is the distinction between zoned capacity. So with climate-friendly areas, we are essentially putting forward requirements for local governments to zone a certain capacity to accommodate homes and jobs and services in climate-friendly areas. This is to meet our targets, as you know, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to improve equitable outcomes. But it is different from the process that cities have used and will continue to use to meet their residential land needs, which, based on statute and rule, must be based on recent development activity data. And so it is not accurate to say that we are allocating 30% of housing to climate-friendly areas. It is our goal for us to get at least 30% of housing in climate-friendly areas by 2035. And we are basically setting the table for that to happen. We're trying to put together a package of land use regulations that will facilitate that kind of development, but we're not requiring it to happen. We can't require it to happen. And we're not doing it at the expense of land supply to meet other housing needs elsewhere in the community. So it's an important point. And again, I'll hit that in more detail on Thursday. Another component of the housing rules, unless there are questions on that point, I see none, is that CFA requirements will be updated with each housing capacity analysis. So every 6 years, well, that wouldn't occur in, I'm sorry, that's not in Metro. So outside of Metro, every 8 years, as the city's population over 10,000 are doing their new housing capacity analysis, as they grow, there would be an associated requirement for, well, you'd have a new total housing need, and then you would take that 30% number and figure out, okay, it looks like we need additional climate-friendly area, and the local government would then go through that exercise. That's one component of the rule, and the other component of the rule is in conjunction with residential urban growth boundary expansions that would occur after June 30 of 2027. Also, I think we've noted climate-friendly area studies include assessment of the potential for displacement, identification of mitigation strategies. That's a very important part of the work, and we want that to happen at the outset. So local governments can weigh their options. They can look at potential negative impacts that might occur with CFA designation and make some decisions about, does it make sense to designate this area as a climate-friendly area and adopt mitigation strategies, or might there be other areas where we wouldn't have the potential for negative impacts? And then lastly, the housing rules require housing production strategy reports over time to assess progress made in housing development within climate-friendly areas, including affordable and accessible units. So that's how the housing rules will operate. And that's kind of what I have on climate-friendly areas, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Commissioner Lilac.
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. My question is, do we need in the residential requirements the maximum building heights if we have the minimum residential density requirements? And I just ask because the maximum building heights are absolutely a lightning rod issue, and people see the worst case scenario and fear. So my question is, our thinking is do we need those height limits, or can we achieve our objectives with the minimum density standards?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Lilac. I think if we were to keep only the minimum density standards, we are more likely to receive development that is at the minimum. And what we're planning for is something more than minimum density. We know that at a minimum density of 15 acres or more, or 15 units per acre or more, that gets to a level of density that supports good transit service. So that's kind of one of the key fundamental foundations for a climate-friendly area. Could building heights be changed? Yes, they could. But understand too that the way that we're planning for climate friendly areas is what we've done is we've taken that goal of, okay, 30% of housing units in climate friendly areas, how do we operationalize that? And essentially what we've done is conceptually built a space in the air, within these zones to say you can build to this amount, and within that area, you assume this much residential development. So if building heights come down, we're gonna have to recalibrate that whole system. It could be done, but it would certainly change the math in terms of getting to that 30% target.
So Stuart, I know you had your hand up, but I have a follow-up point I wanted to make about this topic. So if it's okay with you, I'll go ahead. And maybe Nick, you have some comments too. I think this is a topic we should discuss on Thursday because perhaps I hear what Nick has said, and I've seen those comments and heard those comments, and it is kind of a lightning rod. Not that we should shy away from them if it is the absolute right thing to do, but I'm also wondering if exploring the idea of having zoning and comprehensive plan designations. So one could have comprehensive plan designations that are the full height, and zoning is lower, and they have that in some cities. They have it in Portland. And so generally you go to a certain zoning, you can build up the zoning on the property, but then to move from zoning to comp plan designation, there's some other criteria that fits in there. And maybe we can fit in some other things in there as well. Just a thought, and there might be other ways to do that, but I probably have gone too far in terms of my comments, in terms of like what I'm thinking of. So I won't go any further, but Nick, back to you. Do you have any other comments before we talk about it further on Thursday?
No, thank you.
I'll just say briefly, Chair MacArthur, thank you for that thought. And it is helpful. I mean, one scenario, another scenario we could look to would be establishing, say, minimum and maximum densities. If we're wanting a range and we're less focused on building height, we're more focused on, okay, how many units can we get in this area? That might be another approach that we could consider.
Sure, thank you. Commissioner Warren.
Yeah, a couple things that I think we should talk about, before the meeting. The first one I think is just to help us understand what rezoning to mixed use will do, and the kind of hypothetical situation I want to throw out there, which is probably going to happen. Say we have a single family house that is now included in the CFA, rezoned to mixed use, and that owner would like to build an ADU behind that. Would that prompt, would mixed use zoning allow them to even do that?
That's a very good question, Commissioner Warren, and thank you for asking it. What we have tried to do with our code is to have a relatively light touch on what the local implementing climate friendly area zones might do, including allowed housing types. It is true that at a minimum density of 15 units per acre, it's challenging to build single family detached. It's not completely out of the question, but there's also another issue that local governments frequently deal with, which is what is sometimes referred to as legal non-conforming development. And so if there's existing development in these areas that maybe it doesn't meet the new density standard, there's nothing that the local government is not required, obviously, to eliminate that development or redevelop or anything like that. The market operates as it does. On the ADU question, I'm not sure that I can answer that, because if we were to apply a 15 unit per acre minimum, depending on the land area involved, that may or may not be within that realm. So it's not out of the question, but it's possible it would not meet that minimum density requirement.
Thank you for that. And then my next question is about home ownership questions or comments that we're getting a lot of. And I would just love to hear kind of what the department's thinking is around including home ownership in CFAs, because I think it's something we need to be really clear about.
Well, certainly, and thank you for the question, Commissioner. Certainly, it is not our policy. We are, the agency's perspective is we want to allow as many home ownership opportunities as we possibly can everywhere, including in climate friendly areas. We know that right now there are challenges with a sort of a multifamily development type, with making that an ownership model. The condominium process is complicated and challenging, but it is not impossible. I also will note, I just recently saw a white paper from Eco Northwest prepared a white paper on cooperative housing, which I thought was very promising. This is a model that's used quite a bit on the East Coast, and in other contexts, co-housing sometimes is a cooperative model. That was a really exciting white paper, because it in particular was talking about limited equity cooperative housing, which is a great tool for allowing low-income folks to build equity in housing and to keep that housing in long-term equity building capacity. People can buy in and sell their shares, and the buildings themselves remain, promoting those goals. So those are options, but also, attached single family is possible with the densities that we're talking about. Some types of middle housing, I think, will be possible with the densities that we're talking about. Remember that local governments as the rules are currently written, there's a primary climate friendly area that's kind of more intensive, but also the local governments can choose less intensive climate friendly areas elsewhere where they may have lower densities, lower building heights, and may be able to achieve a greater housing variety as well.
So I'm going to make one request for the meeting on Thursday, is just to maybe have like one slide devoted to home ownership and what home ownership could look like in a CFA. And I would definitely love to see, some pictures of the kind of cottage cluster model, and also the land, the limited equity co-op. I think it's a really exciting model. So if I can make that request, at least.
You bet, of course.
Yeah, please make sure to include the higher density home ownership models.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
I would say Europe has some really good examples, the UK in particular.
So this is a nice segue to identifying the topics that commissioners would like staff to cover at the hearing on Thursday. And so if you can think about, I'll go through my list and obviously add to it, populate it, but the kind of the frame is, what topics do commissioners want to have staff review and discuss prior to listening to the public comment time, so that we can come back and provide guidance on those. Some might just be things you want to have clarified, but in fact, if there are certain things you want to provide guidance to staff on, I think it's really critical for us to talk about it and get our heads around it, but also it signals to the public that if they have some thoughts about that, the time is to comment on that prior to providing guidance. So it's kind of twofold. It's what we need to have, but also signaling to the public that this is their time to talk about these particular issues. So my short list is the local partner timelines and deadlines. Kind of a generic kind of cumulative thing: housing supply, affordability, displacement, and home ownership. All those topics, and they're probably covered together. Guidance around how to assess and measure equitable outcomes. It might just be going over the section that you referred to, page, attachment F, page, whatever, 47, 48. It might just be going over that so we all understand it, but the public does as well. NACDO standards, pros and cons of using those. CFA minimum density requirements and height associated with that. And then the rezoning one that you mentioned just a little bit ago, Stuart. So why don't you frame that for staff so they understand it better than what I've just said?
just maybe helping the general public understand what rezoning actually means, and then the potential issues and the benefits of doing it, I think would be super helpful for that conversation.
Thank you. And please, commissioners, add to that list. And staff, if you have any questions about what I just said, please ask as well. I want to make sure we are on the same page about what we think we might need and give clarity to you as well.
I think something I would like to hear that I really believe in these rules is the fact that we're removing a lot of regulation, like the building height thing. I think, we get caught up in the fact that, okay, 85 feet is the new standard, so everything's going to get built to 85 feet, but the market's not going to actually build to 85 feet. And same with parking reform, right? We know that we're removing parking minimums. That doesn't mean that developers can't build, a certain number of spaces. I mean, the parking maximum does limit that, but I think talking about it really clearly and like throwing in that kind of market conversation would be really helpful.
Great, good one.
I'll just jump in and offer another one. And this is on page 66, 0330, land use requirements 3A through D, the urban design standards. I'm a huge fan of urban design. I want to talk about whether we need this level of specificity in administrative rule about street facing buildings and things of this nature. I mean, to me, we're talking about metro areas with highly sophisticated planners that get urban design. Do we need to put this level of specificity in administrative rule? That's one question I have, or one idea that I could discuss. Another one is just street and highway system planning. There's a lot of references to state highways and freight routes, et cetera. And some of those are under local control, but most of those are under ODOT's authority. And so I don't know what level of requirements we're putting on local governments to address state requirements. If we can just touch on that at some point, I think that would be good, because there's only so much control they have. This isn't in the rules, but this comes to it, and it's one of the overarching issues we're hearing about, and that's the fiscal impact statement. Does it adequately address the cost to implement these rules? I just think we need to talk about that. I've heard that Bend and Eugene are both estimating that adopting and implementing these rules are going to cost $5 to $10 million, maybe an average of $7. And the agency's asking for good money, but it may be just a fraction of what's needed to actually address implementation issues. So those are a couple more topics I'd like to hope we touch on Thursday. Thank you.
I'd like to have a little bit of reflection on Tuesday on, I know we talk a lot about housing, but some of the testimony we've seen is about business and freight routes and that sort of thing. So I think talking a little bit about economic development would be useful. We'll probably get those verbal comments as well.
This is the last thing I'll tack on, I promise, but I would love to hear just a great conversation around the process. I'm sure you all are going to do that, but I really think that is like the root of these rules, and it's been a great process. And the more we can drive that home, I think the better.
So any questions from staff, clarity about what we're asking for?
Chair MacArthur, probably just one last thing is I do expect we'll continue to get a lot of input over the next couple of days, which could make for a long night tomorrow night, and then a lot of testimony. And I think I reflect that probably the perspective of many is it feels a bit like a moving target, is that, that the rules came out on March 1st. Thank goodness. I'm so thankful that staff then issued another version on March 17th, but then in the middle, we got all these comments, and now we're getting new comments, and I'm not sure. I appreciate knowing today what has been amended and changed in the rules since March 1st and since March 17th, but it is a challenging task to track all of the moving pieces and parts. So I just acknowledge that up front. I'll do the best I can. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I applaud staff for trying to keep up with all the incoming, but I totally get at the other end, as we read it and the public reads it, even though they're being responsive to all the comments that are coming in, it's kind of a, what I'd prefer them to do what they're exactly doing. But I get your point, Commissioner Lilac. Can be confusing to others. And I just can't say enough great things about staff. I mean, I just think you've refined your knowledge of this work, your presentations, the way you frame it. It's just, even from the last work session, it's just, I think I see a vast change and improvement and an understanding of how to present. So excellent job on that. I had just a real quick thing for staff. I had talked about reserving some time up front on Thursday to kind of have commissioners come together about the purpose and the charge and everything. I don't think we need that time. I think commissioners are very engaged. So acquire that time, take that time back and fill in the blanks and do your agenda the way you need to do it relative to trying to hit on these topic areas. Just whatever you get done, you know, whenever you've kind of refined the agenda, if you could send like the annotated agenda for those pieces, send it to Anjali and I so that we know how to manage that work, those timeframes. Thank you. I don't, unless there is any, oh, I guess we're over time anyway, aren't we? Ooh, sorry about that. So yeah, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.